Hello, everyone. Loremaster of Sotek here, and happy holidays. Hope you all had a merry SLAANESHMAS, which today we have come together to celebrate. Creative Assembly may currently be on vacation, so I don't want to release videos heavily focused on fixing issues or patch-focused content. Instead, we'll talk about what the Prince of Pleasure will be potentially bringing to Total War Warhammer 3 instead. It does feel like the perfect time to do so, with Games Workshop revealing the new Demon Prince Fulgrim model for 40k alongside future reveals for the Emperor's Children coming up. Congrats to those excited for the upcoming releases, by the way. In any event, let's take some time to talk about and show off the things I think Slaanesh will be bringing to the table as the finale of the Mono Gods DLCs comes hurtling towards us. Similar to the prior DLC focus series, I'll be tackling a different faction with each video, so for this one we'll only cover Slaanesh. Starting with the legendary lord who will herald the arrival of hedonistic excess is the only real choice, in my opinion. The Warhammer Fantasy six-armed big snake, Dechala the Denied One. I actually think it makes thematically perfect sense for her to step up, or slither up rather, for this role, as it would add a fitting mirror to the god factions over this tetralogy. By that, I mean we started with a lesser demon legendary lord with the Changeling, followed by a heavily mutated mortal legendary lord in Tarmakon, and of course, recently featured another lesser demon legendary lord with Skulltaker. So let's keep the pattern up with another heavily mutated mortal to finish it off with Dechala, who is not a demon princess, just to be clear. So, just who is this Serpentine Dommy Mommy? Well, down in the pinned comment below, I'll include a link to the Lorebeards episode Andy Law and I spent talking about her if you'd like a 3-hour deep dive. But to summarize, she is an elven princess that long ago suffered greatly at the hands of the demon prince Samael. The oldest such entity belonging to Slaanesh, Samael engineered a sinister plot to corrupt Dechala mind, body, and soul, tormenting her family with constant trauma until her father broke, agreeing to hand his own daughter over to a demon to spare his family. This betrayal, combined with all the horror Samael had unleashed to erode her will, pushed Dechala over the edge. When her new demonic husband offered her the wedding gift of slaughtering her own family, she couldn't resist the temptation to vent her fury. Despite all the horrors unleashed during the cataclysm, the site on Ulthuan where Dechala visited tortures upon her shrieking father is one of the most cursed locations. From here, Dechala would lose herself utterly to Slaanesh under Samael's tutelage, growing in the god of excess's favor as the years passed. However, the servants of Slaanesh are ever a jealous sort, even by the standards of Chaos Champions, and Samael grew fearful that his elven wife would soon outshine even him. Dechala sensed his intentions and fled into the Chaos Waste before Samael could act, abandoning her husband for the mortal realm where a demon such as he would struggle to manifest. Incensed, the demon prince turned to Slaanesh and demanded his patron return his wayward lover. This angered Slaanesh, who rebuked Samael for daring to demand anything of them. Despite this chastisement, Slaanesh still adored their mighty demon prince, and thus granted him a compromise. Dechala would never be forced or compelled by any force other than her own will to return and submit to her husband. But, so long as Samael existed, neither would she ever be granted demonhood and risen to Slaanesh's side. Ever since that day, she has been known as the Denied One, for while she may rise to the absolute height of the Dark Prince's favor, she shall never receive the greatest gift. At least, so long as her husband lives. Over the millennia that have passed since, Dechala has become one of the mightiest warlords to roam the northern Chaos Wastes. She leads a terrible horde known as the Taknaisen, or the Tormentors, the most feared Slaaneshi warband across the world due to their love of torture and fanatical dedication to their mistress. Most notably, they're constantly accompanied by legions of enslaved followers that are bound by neither chain or rope. Instead, they're all addicted to a horrid substance known as the Elixir of Damnation. Just one drop of this substance will irrevocably shatter the will of the unfortunate who drinks it, causing them to serve Dechala without question in the hopes of acquiring more of the elixir. To make matters worse, the elixir itself is corruptive. A mixture of warpstone, blood, and Dekhala's own fluids, it takes very small amounts to cause extreme mutation that eventually leads to the victim's body breaking down entirely. This leading to the tormentors having a considerable amount of twisted chaos spawn shambling beside them into battle. The favored concubine always on the prowl for enemies to forcefully convert to her will with just a drop. As for Dechala herself, she is a large chaos champion of Slaanesh, blessed with a staggering number of mutations. 6 arms sprout from her torso, often depicted wielding an assortment of blades, though there does exist art depicting a bow as well. Her scaled flesh is milk white, with her legs having been replaced with a sinuous tail ending in a scorpion-like stinger dripping with venom. With all that out of the way, we now have a good understanding of Dechala and the important details surrounding her. When it comes to Total War, I think we could say with safety that Dekhala's faction will be the Tormentors, as she's one of the annoyingly rare characters whose posse we know the name of. When it comes to starting location, Dechala is an interesting case. I could see the argument of putting her in Ulthuan or the Northern Chaos Wastes, as she's well known in those regions, but there's already a considerable amount of Slaanesh representation in the area. Nakari, appropriately, is indulging in his hate boner against the line of Anarian on the floating island, while Sigvald and Azazel terrorize the lands in the north. I think that's enough to disqualify such areas for the denied one. So where do we put her instead? There are 2 reasonable options, in my opinion. The first is that we could simply do the Chaos Wastes, but the southern ones instead. For those unaware, the northern and southern Chaos Wastes are actually connected by the Realm of Chaos itself, as the shattered gates of the old ones tore open both poles on the planet into the ether, essentially. By entering the Realm of Chaos near the northern pole, one could journey through the strange domains of that place to emerge near the southern pole. So having Dechala down there wouldn't be that much of a stretch. She could take over the easternmost province of the Demonium Hills, perhaps in the Altar of Facades or the Castle of Splendor regions. This would allow her early game to focus on whether to partner or war with Cairo's Fate Weaver, in addition to facing the High Elves found in the Southlands with Teclis, and the Eastern Colonies, which is where I think another character we'll talk about later will end up. The other option that I think will probably be far more popular would be for Dechala to start either in the new Cathayan Hinterlands province or opening a new province just east of Helmengorst, functionally adding in a province on the very northern edge of End, just south of Noblar country. This would tie into Dechala being present in End during the End times, as she engaged in a contest with Arbal the Undefeated to see which of them could annihilate more of that nation. I'd be fine with either, as long as they're both, they're in kind of that southeastern theater which would be a very fresh new starting location for Slaanesh. When it comes to Dechal's faction and its effects, she'll definitely take a role similar to Tamarkan and Arbal, with considerable buffs to mortal units on the roster. I also think she'll have a considerable buff to Chaos Spawn and Forsaken in her personal army to represent those individuals twisted by the Elixir of Damnation. Speaking of, I also think that will be one of the main thrusts for Dechala mechanics-wise. The Elixir of Damnation could function as a unique resource that she can spend before battles to turn enemy units in addition to those she can gain through seduction. But hers, the Elixir of Damnation, would result in units that were turned being unbreakable. I would also like to see her granting buffs to cultists of Slaanesh, maybe additional recruit ranks and stuff like that, as they appear to be corrupted elves, just like her. Lastly, when it comes to battle and what she does in battle, I do hope Creative Assembly decides to spice up Dechala just a smidge. Her original tabletop version is the nasty snake woman with 6 blades that carves people up with an absurd number of attacks, which is fine, but there's a piece of artwork from the Liber Chaotica that depicts her also wielding a gigantic bow, and I think it'd be a nice nod to her elven roots to have her function as a melee ranged hybrid. This would make her far more unique, as Nakari kinda already dominates the melee blender character role already. So, with a bow and 6 blades, or a bow and 4 blades if she just holds the bow at all times, Dechala is a terrifying melee combatant that also benefits from a full set of chaos armor, plus her scaly skin, making her surprisingly tanky, especially compared to the likes of Nakari and Azazel, who are running around practically nude. Not quite as durable as the regenerating spoiled brat that is Sigvald with his mirror shield, however. When it comes to items, her only noted one is, of course, the Elixir of Damnation, which in tabletop was so obscenely overpowered that it's just dumb. If Dechala landed a single unsaved wound with her just stupid number of attacks at the highest speed possible, the victim could not attack, shoot, or use magic against her for the remainder of the game. That's insane. A fairer version for Total War would probably be granting her poisoned attacks and an active ability that when she uses causes her attacks to force enemies to rampage and have their melee attack just nuked into oblivion. So she kind of gets like a crazy powerful contact effect. Lastly, she has a very cool system where she's able to take particular stances that represent her utilizing her blades and serpentine body in like sword dances that have powerful effects. The first is called the Praise of Slaanesh, which while active should vastly increase Decala's melee defense and missile defense, or missile resistance rather, as she fights with movements to enthrall her enemies, her twisting body proving nearly impossible to hit. Second is the Dance of Destruction, which while active should increase her melee attack and weapon strength as she swirls with frantic energy to tear apart those before her. Finally, there's the Dagger Dance, which should be an active ability in my opinion rather than a stance, which should make her invulnerable for a short time, kind of like how Valkia does, but it also vastly decreases her melee attack while it's active, as Dechala is focusing on creating a twisting wall of steel with her blades that none can penetrate, rather than attacking. When it comes to stats and things like that, Dechala should move extremely fast across the ground and be a tad bit larger than most infantry characters like Azazel, but not monstrous sized. So, probably still count as an infantry sized character, but a bit bigger than you would expect. Though I'd kind of be fine if she was large, but maybe, not big, scary monster large, but like monstrous infantry size large. Because her tabletop mini kind of looks like she should be monstrous infantry. as does her artwork, but I think her technical rule, she was more just like regular infantry sized. Anywho, medium to high armor with extremely high melee attack and melee defense, very high leadership, and weapon strength that's respectable. Dechala was actually printed in the same book as Azazel for tabletop rules, the old Champions of Chaos book, and she was notably faster and more skilled as a combatant than him. But Azazel did much higher damage when he actually landed a blow, and he was technically more survivable because he relied on like a really fancy ward save instead of the good armor that Dechala had, which armor is good, but more things are able to reduce and get through armor, whereas a ward save just is. Anyway, that wraps up Dechala, but we're just getting started, of course. Next up, we have our free LC contender to discuss, who I earnestly hope will be the choice that Creative Assembly will go with to maintain the consistency we have going with the Chaos Tetralogy, as I'm calling it. The most feared lesser demon of Slaanesh, that cavorting entity known as the Masque. This infamous demonette was once the most favored of all her kind, an embodiment of the joy of dance, who wove such enrapturing displays that even the gods were struck silent in awe. Yet, she was undone when Slaanesh suffered their most terrible loss in the Great Game, having been manipulated by Tzeentch into a war with both Nurgle and Khorne that proved impossible to win. The Masque had thought to ease her master's mind by dancing for him with a performance greater than any she had ever put on before. No mortal soul could have witnessed this dance and be unmoved, but the Dark Prince stewed in the bitterness of their humiliation. She who thirsts looked upon the dance and saw only subtle mockery and barbed jest, where in truth none existed. Without warning, Slaanesh could take no more and exploded into apoplectic rage. They laid a curse upon the Masque, condemning her to dance for all eternity against her will, unable to rest or take pause to partake of any other experience. Her dances would now only speak in testament to Slaanesh's glory, every performance dedicated to one of the God of Excess's victories. Their fury spent, Slaanesh turned their back upon the accursed maiden and returned to their inner chambers. The Masque has been doomed ever since, condemned to dance across the mortal and immortal realms to music only she can hear without rest. She appears suddenly at grand feasts, extravagant parties, and spectacular operas, her held masks flickering between countless expressions as her dance progresses, taking on the visage of the character she portrays. The curse placed upon her by Slaanesh is so powerful that even those in her presence are caught up in the unholy pageant, drawn to perform their roles with flawless grace. No demon nor mortal can resist the compulsion, exhausting their limbs even as the very nature of the dance tears at portions of their soul. That covers the important narrative details of the Masque. So let's move on to discussing how the Eternal Dancer might best be implemented in-game. For the faction, one of her titles that could be evolved into a faction name might be the Darkling Deceiver. So for instance, naming the faction the Darkling Deceivers. Though I could also see something simpler, like the Accursed of Slaanesh, to parallel Skarbrand's Exiles of Khorne. Looking at the start locations, the Masque could be placed just about anywhere so long as civilization is in the area. She is known for popping up at grand performances or extravagant parties that act almost like summoning rituals from the various forms of excess on display. Personally, I would place her somewhere in Grand Cathay, as it's a relatively unpopulated part of the world in regards to legendary lords. Not much Slaanesh representation in that ballpark, so she'd be a welcome addition to the cast of villains threatening the Dragon Emperor's lands. I might put her in the southeastern regions between Nakai and Lokir Felhart, as the eastern regions of Grand Cathay are known for their relative opulence due to being the most populated and financially successful part of Cathay under the sea dragon Yin Yin. Either that or maybe the Central Riverlands, perhaps. For her faction focus, the Masque should of course be big on buffing anything with demonettes involved, which is actually a rather significant portion of the Slaanesh roster. I also think she should be the most cult-centric of the three Slaanesh characters, as she takes the most advantage of the seemingly positive aspects of culture, such as art, music, and dance. So perhaps she could have reduced prices on building cult buildings, and the teleportation building that all the Slaanesh characters have access to through the cult system should either be free for the Masque, or maybe it's built at significantly reduced time. Like maybe it always takes her one turn to build it. Finally, she should of course have buffs for the Alluris heroes. For her personal army buffs, I'd suggest further buffs for demonette units and her unique gimmick of a dance mechanic. The Masque is said to perform through a staggering number of dances that tell of Slaanesh's greatest victories both in the past and the future, for time means nothing in the realm of chaos. From the pageant of pain that tells of a great victory she who thirsts won over Khorne, to the caging of Loek that has yet to occur. I would recommend making all of these dances and adding a few more that act as campaign abilities similar to Tzeentch's Changing of the Ways and Grease's Goldtooth's Tyrant Demands, where the Masque has the ability to force enemy armies or settlements to do certain kinds of things with appropriate Slaanesh flavoring. Lastly, that takes us to her battle mechanics. The Masque is an exceptionally swift infantry duelist that is surprisingly durable despite her initial appearance. She benefits from a passive known as Unnatural Reflexes, which in tabletop granted her an insanely high ward save to offset her low armor and small health pool. For Total War, I think this could either be an active buff that grants a very, very high ward save for a healthy period of time, or, and this is what I would personally prefer, a passive ability that gives her still a very generous ward save, perhaps as long as she's not within close distance of allied units. So she has to be outside of 30 meters, let's say. This would combo nicely with a unique tabletop rule she had called Dances Alone, which basically just said that the Masque was never allowed to join units to balance out her incredible defenses. So, for instance, what I'm thinking of is that on the battlefield, if the Masque is not within 30 meters of any allied units, she gains a 75% ward save, or maybe a 60%, but she should be mitigating the hell out of damage. Of course, the offset to that being that she doesn't have much in the way of armor, and she, of course, doesn't have a very big health pool. You know, she's fairly squishy, and unlike many of the other characters we'll talk about and have talked about, she doesn't have any mounts. She's a pure infantry character because she's dancing. I would note that if we are going to do that with the whole dances alone thing, to keep her from just popping due to leadership, I don't think she should be unbreakable, but I would at the very least add a leadership buff to that passive. So maybe in addition to the ward save, when she's alone, she also gets plus 10 leadership or something to kind of offset penalties for being surrounded and, surrounded by superior enemies and yada, yada, yada. Then you have her abilities, which tie into her signature dances, of which there are 3. Similar to Dechala, they could be stances, but I could also see the argument for just making them active abilities, since each of them acts as a debuff aura. But I don't think either choice is wrong. So you could either have it where she's got the 3 dances and they count as, stances like we see with the Black Orcs and stuff, where you have one of them active at all times and you just change to whichever one you want. And then there's like a very brief cooldown before you can change to another one. Or you could just make them active abilities where you click on it and they go off. And then after a certain amount of time, they wear off and they're on cooldown, yada, yada. Any of it. Each dance, in my opinion, should have a pretty healthy radius. I'm thinking 35 or 55 meters. I would think 55 meters to kind of allow her to have that bubble of, oh, she has to be by herself in this bubble, but she has a big enough debuff range that you can still benefit from it and like move your units in and attack enemies without getting too close to her. So I would say like 55 meter radius feels good to me. And these buffs should do the following as enemies are forced to join in their performance. The Dance of Dreaming. This dance depicts the slumbering dark prince waiting to be born. It is represented by a sedentary and languid form of movements that drag down those afflicted spiritually. This dance should reduce the leadership of enemies in range and remove the immune to psychology ability from them. So make it where they suffer from fear and terror. Next is the Flesh Spasm Polka, which no doubt was written by Weird Al. This represents the joyous ecstasy that Slaanesh brings to flesh and relies on a rapid tempo that tears muscle and breaks bone. It should reduce the melee attack and weapon strength of afflicted enemy units by a decent amount. Lastly, we have the Waltz of Lethargy, representing the eternal sloth Slaanesh manifested to birth the Circle of Indolency. This dance has a slow tempo that makes every physical movement drag out. It should reduce the speed and melee defense of enemy units within range. Finally, that leaves items, which, to be technical, the Warhammer Fantasy version of the Masque doesn't have any magic items. However, the model, which I'll have had a fair amount on screen during this whole thing, and even the lore of the character has a very obvious item that should be a magic item. And it was upgraded to a proper magic item in Age of Sigmar. That, of course, is her Staff of Masques, which is a major feature of every version, so both versions, of her miniature that Games Workshop has printed. As for what the Staff of Masques should do, it's said to flick between various guises that enhance the Eternal Dancer's ability to attack and defend as she twirls it around, and one of them enhances her more offensive abilities and the other side enhances her more defensive abilities. Perhaps it could be an active ability that buffs her melee attack and melee defense. If we look to Age of Sigmar, where the item became an actual magic item, it either can grant a pretty sizable heal to the Masque, or it just gives her more attacks, which would be a welcome addition considering her low health pool. I don't think it'd be that overpowered for her to have an item which, when it's activated, gives her a bonus to her melee attack and maybe gives her some health regeneration. But once again, this character should have a very small health pool. Like, when you compare her to pretty much all of the other demonic legendary lords, she should probably have the smallest health pool next to... No, she should have the smallest of all of them, I would think. All right. That takes care of our legendary lords. But we've got one more named character to tackle. That, of course, being our new Slaanesh legendary hero. There is a perfect choice for this slot for reasons we'll talk about a little later. And although this character was not technically playable, he did have two really badass minis, which is a big point up for him. And also, Slaanesh didn't actually have all that many characters throughout most of Warhammer Fantasy. Of course, I am talking about Styrkaar of the Sortsvinaer tribe. I'll be brief with this character compared to the Masque and Dechala, but to summarize things, Styrkaar was a Norscan prince born to the Sortsvinaer tribe that lived along the northern coast of Norska. From a young age, he had heard the voice of a mysterious entity calling itself Slaazuzu that would whisper him words of advice and commands that always seemed to improve whatever situation he found himself in. So he would say the perfect thing to get out of trouble or be at the right place at the right time. Growing up under an abusive yet protective father, who was the tribe's chieftain, Styrkaar managed to mold himself into a beloved hero of his people, thanks to his martial prowess and the tutelage of Slaazuzu. Eventually, he carefully manipulated his people into favoring him over his father, and during a feast celebrating one of his many victories, lured the old man into striking him out of jealousy. The Norskins despised this petulant act by their chieftain and urged on Styrkaar to challenge his drunken father, allowing him to murder and take his place as chieftain of the Sortsvinaer. From here, the voice of Slaazuzu would encourage Styrkaar to dedicate his people, his altars, and his victories to the glory of Slaanesh. And that he did, rising ever further in power and glory. The Dark Prince rewarded him mightily, revealing the shadow spirit of Slaazuzu to be a demon of Slaanesh, and fusing the etheric entity into Styrkaar's own mind and body. Thus did the two become one. Styrkaar's mind sharpened, his silver tongue blessed by Slaazuzu to always say what those he spoke to wished to hear. Mutations gripped his body as his teeth lengthened into delicate fangs, and his skin radiated with an unnatural glow as if some unholy light burned within him. With demon and man now as one, Styrkaar's legacy only catapulted further as other Norscan tribes gathered to worship him. Now a king of Norska, Styrkaar received one further gift from his patron in the form of a mighty serpent steed of Slaanesh. These demonic mounts were rare creatures of horrid elegance and impossible speed, towering over the bipedal steeds of Slaanesh ridden by demonettes or hellstriders. With such obvious blessings by Slaanesh, or Shornal as he was known to Styrkaar's tribe, the chieftain grew to be an unrivaled threat in the north of Norska, until destiny came calling. It was the arrival of Archaon the Everchosen that would change the trajectory of Styrkaar's life, as Slaanesh whispered into his dreams to serve this new warlord rather than challenge him. Thus did Styrkaar go on to become one of the 4 marked heralds of Archaon, after killing his predecessor for the role, Vandred the Majestic, thus fulfilling the prophecy of fate's omen about Slaanesh's champion, which said, "A king's son shall be the chosen, in power he will thrive, and glory in his name." Now, what happened next would take place in the alternate timeline that was the Storm of Chaos, but Styrkaar would go on to lead a powerful horde into the lands of the Empire around the Middle Mountains, just south of Erengrad. He obliterated the towns of Kurst and Zundap, but then, in Slaaneshi fashion, became delayed by excessive victory celebrations. This led to him arriving late to lay siege to Hergig, although he did successfully sack the capital of Hochland thanks to some aid from the Skaven. However, due to the exhausting siege and the following celebrations, Styrkaar completely missed the final battle at the Siege of Middenheim, no doubt a notable contributing factor to Archaon's failure. After this, he departed once more for Norska, surviving the Storm of Chaos to continue being a threat to the world. As a legendary hero, due to his backstory, I would make Styrkaar available to all Slaanesh factions, obviously, Archaon, Be'lakor, Kolek, Sigvald, Azazel, and all Norscan factions. Seeing as he himself is a Norscan, and it provides a nice balance to them having access to Scylla and Fingrim. Khorne and Slaanesh are hated rivals after all, so let's keep that scale balanced for Norska. Mechanics-wise, Styrkaar should provide notable buffs to all Marauder units in the army he joins, alongside buffing some of the new units we'll talk about later, most notably the Serpent Knights. In many ways, I see him as similar to Scar Bloodwrath in regards to the various units he buffs. though I would also grant him bonuses to cavalry units like Chaos Knights of Slaanesh, Seekers, Exalted Seekers, Hellstriders, etc. When it comes to battle, Styrkaar isn't actually a well-explored character, despite his fairly deep lore. He had a gorgeous model on tabletop, both on foot and mounted, which I hope to see Creative Assembly accurately transpose into Total War, but never had an actual playable profile. So we have no idea what magic items he had or what exactly his abilities were. His lore mentions that Styrkaar was exceptionally graceful in his movements and enjoyed taking on large groups of enemies instead of being more of a duelist. His people quite literally worshipped him, screaming in exultation at his displays of psychotic debauchery. So perhaps he should have some localized leadership buffs to allied units, be more specialized against groups of enemies instead of individual targets. Obviously, he wears quite a bit of armor. He's got like a big old shield, so fairly tanky, reasonably defensive as you go. Styrkaar was also noted for specializing in inflicting pain and fear upon his enemies, that being the particular form of excess he partook in. So I could see maybe an active ability where he could deal big AoE damage, perhaps as he does like a big swing with his weapon, or it's a cone template attack that also lowers the leadership a bit of enemies that are hit by it. Other than that, his curved blade is the only item really mentioned. You hear that? They have curved swords, though nothing on what exactly it does. As far as we know, it's just a cool curved sword. Anyway, being partially possessed as he's fused with a demon, I could see him having some notable gimmick normally reserved for demonic characters. Perhaps for the Slaanesh faction, he has access to the Soul Siphon passive, where he deals damage to enemies around him if they're having like little leadership issues and stuff. Or maybe he could have the Harvester of Soul passive, where he's able to heal if people around him are failing leadership and routing and stuff like that. Then, of course, he should be able to be either on foot or mounted on his iconic Serpent steed of Slaanesh, or Serpent of Slaanesh, or whatever we're going to call it, because as we'll discuss later, that creature doesn't actually have a official name at the moment. Being a demonic creature, it should of course grant him magical attacks once he's mounted, and maybe some other contact effect like poison or charmed. We'll talk more about the Serpents of Slaanesh and their gimmick and all that stuff later. As for how to recruit him, I would imagine something fairly simple like recruiting a certain number of mounted Slaanesh units, or getting a certain amount of kills with Marauders and Hellstriders. Standard Legendary Hero quest nonsense. That wraps up my predictions and desires for the Slaanesh legendary characters. So let's finally get started on generic characters. This section is going to be rather cut and dry as it's extremely predictable, but for the generic lord, the only option is, of course, the Sorcerer Lord of Slaanesh. He'll bring into battle the lords of Shadow or Slaanesh, respectively, have access to the Soul Feeder passive, just like the hero level version does, where he can heal whenever he's casting spells, and be a fairly standard Chaos Sorcerer Lord, similar to the others. He'll, of course, have the mount options of being on foot, a Chaos Steed, a Serpent of Slaanesh, or a Chaos War Shrine. Next up, we have the Exalted Hero of Slaanesh, a heavily armored melee combatant that will finally give Slaanesh a generic tanky hero. I do hope he'll have a fun design, as there are some exceptionally cool Slaanesh warrior character models out in the world. I think it'd be nice to see him with either multiple weapons or whip and shield. And when I say multiple weapons, I mean because he has several extra arms, not like just dual wielding, because that's kind of more Khorne's thing. But I think whip and shield might work the best, because if he had that, it would help differentiate him from the Chaos Lord of Slaanesh, because he would be more focused on having the Hell Scourge buffs. But what I will say is, if you go with the option where he has like a lot of extra arms in true Slaanesh fashion, then I think he should have much more of an armor piercing focus, because the regular Chaos Lord of Slaanesh doesn't have much AP. But then again, the Allurus is kind of the AP hero. So yeah, I would probably recommend him going Hell, Scourge, Whip, and Shield. Because if he has that, then he would get Expert Charge Defense, Charge Reflection, Poisoned Attacks, and really good melee defense. So that would give us a really, really durable character, which would be good for Slaanesh heroes. You know, especially if he's kind of more about bringing some kind of nice buff abilities to the table and is good at kind of targeting enemies and getting them into duels and stuff, making it where he's just obscenely tanky in addition to having like poison and all that, I think would make for a very effective addition next to the Cultist, the Allurus, and the Sorcerer hero. So yeah, I think that could work well. For mount options, he'll, of course, be the same as kind of the rest of the Exalted heroes, where you can either have him on foot, a Chaos Steed, a Chariot, or a Serpent of Slaanesh. That concludes generic characters, so let's move on to the 5 units that I'd like to see come with Slaanesh. Before we get into this, I do want to acknowledge a few quick things. Firstly, I will not include on my list the Giant Spined Chaos Beast or the Great Chaos Spawn, because I believe these monsters could be added with other rosters later on. Most notably with Norska, I think would be very appropriate for bringing the Giant Spine Chaos Beast, as it's literally just a monster-sized Chaos Warhound that's really mutated. And Norska has like 3 wolf/hound type units. And then the Great Chaos Spawn, I think would be better for joining alongside a Beastman DLC, assuming we get one, as they also utilize Chaos Spawn. And of course, they have the Chaos Spawn character with Morgur the Shadowgave. So, with those out of the way, let's move on to my picks. First up, not sure what the unit will actually be called, so I'll currently dub them as the Hellreavers of Slaanesh. But this unit will be the Slaanesh Elite Monstrous Cavalry, similar to the Rot Beast Knights for Nurgle, Doom Knights for Tzeentch, and Skullcrushers for Khorne. An extremely fast unit of ass-kicking knights riding big, angry serpent-like creatures that likely will have powerful charge buffs, such as Devastating Flanker or maybe Glorious Charge. Well, definitely Devastating Flanker, but maybe also Glorious Charge. As for what the Serpents of Slaanesh actually do, well, we don't actually know. Those big ol' snicks only have ever had specific rules once, which was during the Storm of Chaos, when they were the creatures that were ridden by demonettes for the Pleasureseekers of Slaanesh. So it was the demonettes riding on the serpents. Despite the epic-looking models, these guys were actually just terrible. They had a horrible stat line, no special rules to speak of, and were never printed again. They didn't even have poisoned attacks. They were just bland and just sad. In the following 7th edition book, when we got the first Demons of Chaos book, the mounted demonettes, which were technically a completely different unit, were fused with the Pleasureseekers to create the new and improved Seekers of Slaanesh. The Seekers were awesome with their poison attacks, armor piercing, and excellent stat line. Meanwhile, the Serpents, which were replaced now with the bipedal steeds of Slaanesh, became just the demonic mount that were Slaanesh favored. Which, to be clear, demonic steed, I should say. The demonic steed was a mount type. So if you took like a Chaos Lord, you could mount him on a demonic steed, which gave him some cool things as far as like it improved his stats, yada yada. It was actually pretty nice on like Exalted heroes because it increased how many wounds they had. But it was like between a Chaos Steed and a Manticore. So it wasn't a great mount, but it was okay. The thing that sucked about it was that regardless of what the character was, so like if you had a Chaos Lord of Nurgle or Slaanesh or any of those, the demonic mount was always the exact same. So it didn't gain any like cool special rules or abilities depending on your mark. It was just a decent, hard-hitting mount that was not terribly expensive. So, when it comes to the Steed of Slaanesh, which the Serpent of Slaanesh is what I'm going to call it, Creative Assembly can kind of do whatever they want. Personally, when it comes to what exactly the Hellreavers of Slaanesh, the Serpent of Slaanesh cavalry, would do, I would probably recommend making them an elite anti-large monstrous cavalry unit with poisoned and magical attacks that benefit from high speed, high charge, and devastating flanker. But I would not make them like, I'd probably make them have like decent armor piercing, but not crazy armor piercing. Because the super high armor piercing is the job of like the Exalted Seekers and the Seekers of Slaanesh. So for like that mortal elite unit, I'd probably rely far less on AP, like, have an okay armor piercing ratio, but their big focus should be the devastating flanker, the high charge, high speed, very, very generous armor, and maybe not quite as good as Chaos Knights, but like decent. And then being able, probably poisoned attacks, I think would be fine. Or maybe charmed attacks or something. I don't know, figure it out. You could give them Glorious Charge if you're feeling generous, but the big important thing is that Slaanesh roster doesn't have access to much higher tier anti-large. So that seems like it would be a good niche for them, would be that kind of elite anti-large cavalry unit to go along. I think the only big anti-large Slaanesh has is like the Soul Grinder. And I think that's it. They don't have much in the way of like big halberds and stuff like that. So that seems reasonable. As far as what rosters it would be available to, I would have the Hellreavers of Slaanesh available to Slaanesh and the Warriors of Chaos. Carrying on with our obvious picks, we have the final Gore squad, known as the Slaangors. When looking at their fellows, we see that each of the monogod beastmen has a different speciality, and I would like to maintain that theme. Slaangors are sword and board wielders, with barrier for extra defense that also gets stronger when spells are cast, and they have magical attacks. Pestigors are armor-piercing focused great weapon wielders with poisoned attacks, notably high missile resistance, and a unique disease that drastically slows and lowers the vigor of fleeing enemy units. Finally, the Khorngors are amusingly aggressive halberd wielders. So they have anti-large, charge defense against large, and charge reflection stacked with frenzy, and a unique passive to make them unbreakable at half health to ensure they get their damage in. So, how can the Slaangors slot into this? I would have them be a dual-wielding weapon wielders unit, so 2 hand weapons, that specialize in high mobility anti-infantry focus. They will rely on very high non-armor piercing damage to absolutely melt through lighter armored foes, and perhaps enhanced physical resistance to make up for their lack of armor and shields. I have no idea what unique ability Creative Assembly will give them, but we currently have a mix of 2 buffs and 1 debuff as far as the unique goes, so maybe make it a fun debuff. I will say I personally hope for their like dual weapons, they have a mix of sword and crab claw for their design. So like a mutated crab claw and then like a sword or whatever. But we'll see what happens. As far as what factions they should be available to for multiplayer and stuff, they should be for Slaanesh and the Beastmen, though of course certain Warriors of Chaos, or actually I think they should just be like how the other monogod gores are treated for the Warriors of Chaos, where you're able to get access to them through certain gimmicks, but they're mostly for Slaanesh and the Beastmen. Now, it's time for our elite infantry unit that I feel quite confident will make the roster. We've had Chaos Dwarfs and Chaos Ogres, yes, but what about Chaos Elves? That's right. Next up is the Storm of Chaos unit known as the Devoted of Slaanesh. Alternatively, they could be called the Druchii Anointed, which were the character version, but sounds much cooler in my opinion, but either name works. I'm going to refer to them as the Druchii Anointed, even though I know I said it differently a second ago. because I just think that sounds cooler than Devoted of Slaanesh. And it's like, oh, Druchii's in the name. You know you're talking about elves. Anywho, this should be an extremely elite unit for Slaanesh, comparable to the Wrathmongers of Khorne and aspiring champions for Chaos Undivided. The Druchii Anointed are elves that were exceptionally deep into the cult of pleasure that Morathi conceived in the centuries that followed the Cataclysm. As the elves of Ulthuan expanded across the world into a global power after the defeat of Chaos, their island home grew fat and wealthy off all the riches coming in from the various colonies. While most of the elves' military effort was focused outwards towards the remnants of Chaos worshippers and conquering the western coastline of what we now call the Old World, those who remained at home fell into excess to hold back the boredom of peaceful times. Morathi took advantage of this, founding the pleasure cults to exert her control over Ulthuan so that she might work against the second Phoenix King Belshazzar and set events into motion that would hopefully put Prince Malekith upon the throne. This, of course, would eventually lead to the Sundering, the civil war that split the elven race into that of the Druchii and the Asur, or Dark Elves and High Elves. The vast majority of the Dark Elves that survived the conflict would eventually flee to Naggaroth and found their new nation after Malekith the Witch King was defeated by Phoenix King Kalidor I. But not all did so, for the pleasure cults were swiftly outlawed by Malekith, who despised chaos in all its forms and claimed that Cain would be the ultimate god of the Dark Elves alongside the Kithari, the darker half of the Elven pantheon. While the cults of Authority, the goddess of pleasure in the Elven pantheon, were welcomed in Naggaroth, for those who had been unrestricted back in Ulthuan to indulge in every excess, Authority's pleasures weren't enough. So, these few truly corrupt elves among the early Druchii chose to head further north, venturing into the Chaos Wastes and even further beyond into the realm of chaos itself. Here, they dedicated themselves fully to Slaanesh, reveling in every possible sensation and experience to be found in the ether for thousands of years. However, they have begun to return to the mortal realms, each a terrifyingly powerful warrior that, despite being elves, have slightly mutated. Their pupils so dilated that their eyes are all black, and their flesh the color of ebony or translucent and blue-tinged. The Druchii Anointed would be a unit of dark elves with a unique appearance, indicating their corruption by Slaanesh. Though to be clear, it shouldn't be anything too crazy, so like no horns, no tentacles, no crazy stigmata, because elves are extremely resistant to mutation, and the Anointed are very specifically called out for just having like kind of weird colored skin and eyes. Anywho, these elves have shed all the typical elven weaknesses. Wearing chaos plate armor and possessing demonic strength, they march into battle wielding dual weapons. I would recommend having them be a nasty anti-infantry focused elite unit with something like 16 to 32 guys or models per squad. I'll let Creative Assembly worry about any further specifics. My only other note is that they should not be available to any other factions except for Morathi, or Morathi, I always forget which one it is, Sigvald, and Azazel. So the Slaanesh factions, Morathi, Sigvald, and Azazel. That's it. I could see Archaon getting them through a unique method, which supposedly Creative Assembly is currently working on to add, well, to give him access to Wrathmongers and Skull Reapers, as he doesn't currently. So whatever method they use for that, I would be fine with the Druchii Anointed also being part of that system. Now, with all of the infantry and cavalry units out of the way, let's head into monster territory. Slaanesh is a bit of a tricky bitch when it comes to monsters. as despite the fact they're the god of monster fuckers and CEO of Bad Dragon, there aren't actually any notable Slaanesh-focused monsters. Nurgle, of course, had the Toad Dragon, which is a full-on Nurgle beastie. Great, awesome, cool. Khorne was given the Slaughter Brute, which technically is an undivided monster, not a Khorne monster, but it's also a big, pissed-off, spiky red jerk with slaughter in the name, so close enough. Tzeentch sported both the Cockatrice and the Mutilid Vortex Beast, which are also both undivided creatures. But one is, a big blue bird that can transmute people into stone, and the other is a tentacled hell mass with a literal portal to the realm of chaos on its back, spitting magical blasts at people. Fairly Tzeentch coded. So, with that in mind, what monsters can we get away with gently shoving into the Slaanesh roster? Let's start with our first and most likely contender, in my humble opinion, which is the Basilisk, a large serpentine lizard with 8 legs that are known for being the embodiment of venom in all definitions of the word. These vibrantly colored beasts are known for haunting the forests and mountains of the old world and beyond, living in some of the most treacherous regions. They're often reclusive creatures that poison the land around them due to the venom constantly dripping from their fangs, claws, and spines. Furthermore, their very soul radiates poison, tainting any unfortunate victims who venture anywhere close to the Basilisk. Like most Slaanesh flavored creatures, the Basilisk is nightmarishly swift, able to cover ground far faster than its size would suggest and easily outpacing other monsters. All of this is nothing compared to the true danger of the Basilisk, which is, of course, its maleficent gaze. Contrary to the legends, which speak of a petrifying gaze, similar to that of the Cockatrice, a Basilisk is far, far worse. Instead of turning one to stone, the Basilisk is such a venomous bastard that it can focus the dark malice within its soul upon a target. Should the victim in question not avert their gaze swiftly enough, a vitriolic blast will wither their body. Just a glancing meeting of eye contact will result in the target's skin blistering and burning, almost like being in near intense radiation. A second longer will instead partially melt one's flesh and blacken their organs. While the worst case scenario of catching the full gaze will reduce the target into a steaming pile of polluted flesh. This is regardless of any armor, magical defenses, or even the size of the creature. It is instantly flayed into an unrecognizable pile by such tainted power. You're a giant, instantly dead. You're a dwarf covered in runic armor, instantly dead. You're a great, powerful elven wizard, instantly dead. It is one of the most terrifyingly powerful abilities in the tabletop. Granted, it wasn't easy to land it, but if it hit you with its shooting attack, which was its gaze, and then rolled a d6 and got a 6, you're dead. That's it. You died. Period. There's nothing you could do. So, when it comes to justification for Slaanesh, I'll note that the main themes of Slaanesh revolve around speed, vibrancy, poison, reptilian/insectoid critters, and excess in all its forms. The Basilisk is the very definition of an absurdly excessive poisonous/venomous creature. Between its poisoned attacks, aura of vitriol, and maleficent gaze, there's no other monster that competes. It's just, it shoots poison out of every orifice without having like the bleeds poison rule. It's a vibrantly colored 8-legged reptile with serpentine elements, as many fantasy universes have their basilisks as full-on serpents, and the Warhammer one's kind of inspired by that, despite the fact that it has 8 legs. And this bugger is fast. In tabletop, it was possessing Swift Stride, Forest Strider, and a very, very high movement of 8, making it one of the fastest non-flying monsters in this game. I think that makes it a reasonable addition to the roster that synergizes well with Slaanesh while matching the themes of Slaanesh. So, what would this big beastie actually do in Total War? Well, it would be one of the fastest monsters in the game, at least 75 speed, but I would argue that 80 plus is fair. That's in addition to a slightly above mid-tier armor save for a monster with decent missile resistance for its scaly skin. So, like, good armor, not bad armor by any means, very good armor. It has a very large health pool for a monster. It's not like Titanic in size. It's not as big as a Slaughter Brute or a Mutolith. It's more on par with our big monsters, but it's not like a Titanic-sized monster. It also should have decent stats for combat, though it should have slightly lower weapon strength than one might expect due to the other goodies it brings to the table. Slightly below average leadership as well. It's not a monster that enjoys being surrounded and alone amidst enemies. However, then come all the goodies. The Basilisk will have the Strider passive rule, whatever you want to call it, allowing it to ignore all terrain penalties and maintain a high speed no matter where it wanders. Furthermore, it should be able to hide in forests despite its size, similar to what we see with like the Carnosaur and Beastman monsters, so it should have the hide in forest rule. And of course, comes with poisoned attacks. Obviously, it also causes terror. From there, we get into the unique abilities. First up is the Aura of Vitriol, which represents the Basilisk's aura that taints anything that draws near it, whether it be comprised of steel or flesh. This should be a Mortis engine type effect that causes damage over time to enemies within maybe somewhere between 10 to 30 meters of the Basilisk, so long as it is in combat. I think 10 meters could probably be fair, but a part of me also wants to be a little bigger. The thing with this ability is that it should increase in effect intensity the longer it is in combat. So it should have one of those fillable bars, similar to the Blazing Body passive on certain Chaos Dwarf units, like the Great Taurus or the Bale Taurus, I think it is, where it would deal damage per second while it's in combat and is within like 10 meters of you, we'll say. But if it stays in combat for long enough, it can build up that meter. So by the end of it, it'll deal like twice as much damage once it's been in battle for long enough. This, I think, would best represent how it worked in tabletop, where the aura had a higher chance of dealing damage the longer it was in combat with you. So when it was in close combat with you, every unit in combat with the Basilisk would roll like d6s, and if you got 6s, you took damage. And then the next combat, it would be on 5s or 6s, and the combat after that would be 4, 5, 6, and the combat after that would be 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. So I think that would be a fair way to represent it. And it was a pretty nasty ability because it also ignored regeneration and armor. So ward saves were the only thing that could protect you from it. So having it represented as a damage over time ability that's kind of like a passive while it's running around combat, I think is a fair representation. Finally, we have the Maleficent Gaze, which could be done one of two ways. Either it could be a powerful shooting attack, similar to the Bloodwreck Medusa or like the Sepulchral Stalkers, dealing a just big ol' slap of armor-piercing magical damage to enemies struck. Or it could be an active ability that the Basilisk can use on only single entity targets that deals a hefty amount of damage over time while also lowering speed and armor. I do want to note that in the tabletop rule for the Maleficent Gaze, it could only target a singular model. So like if you tried to shoot it at a unit, the rules stated that you had to pick a single model out of the front rank of the unit for the Basilisk to target, which you may go, oh, well, that's not as good, but it actually was really nice because it meant you could like pick out characters and snipe them. I feel that for me personally, the actual shooting attack would be more thematic, but the active ability might synergize with the rest of the Basilisk kit better. You know, if it's a creature where your goal is to like move fast and try and get into combat, so you're building up your vitriolic aura damage and stuff like that, and it's got like, you know, the poison and all this other stuff, you know, it's like, oh, okay, well, this is a creature I want to have in combat as often as possible. So having it be an active ability that you can target enemies with might be better. But I really love when we get like the gaze as a shooting attack like the Bloodwreck Medusa does. And it would give Slaanesh like a pretty powerful monster with shooting, which would be a nice new toy for him. So personally, I'd go with the shooting attack, but I think both would be fair. And this would be, we'll talk about why in a minute, but this would be your big monster. Like this is your hefty, he's a big monster. You know, he's not as big as like the Elemental Bear and the Dreadsaurian and the Mutilated Vortex Beast. He's not as big as those guys, but he's big. You know, he's certainly up there. As for the factions that should have access to the Basilisk, obviously Slaanesh, but I would also give the Basilisk to the Warriors of Chaos and the Beastmen. I think they should also have access to it. Obviously, if you're playing Warriors of Chaos or Beastmen, the Basilisk would not have a Chaos mark. It would just be normal, just like how we saw they've done with like the Mutilith, Slaughter Brute, and the Cockatrice. All right. That takes us to the final entry for this video, though I do have a brief thing to say first. Some of you may have noticed that, like looking at the timestamps that I'll include and stuff, I did not include the Pleasureseekers of Slaanesh on this list. To make sure everyone's on the same page, the Pleasureseekers were demonettes that ride on the Serpents of Slaanesh. So they're the exact same thing as the Seekers of Slaanesh and the Exalted Seekers of Slaanesh, but they're a monstrous cavalry version. So, you know, they'd be less entities, more health, and maybe some slightly different gimmicks. They appeared in the Storm of Chaos book and then proceeded to never show up ever again, because the mounted demonettes, which were also introduced in the same book, but were riding on what we now know as Steeds of Slaanesh, which are the bipedal creatures with the long tongues, those became the new and better Seekers. And the Pleasureseekers in that book, to be very frank, were a very, and I'll include their page up here so y'all can see it. They're a very, very boring unit with no special rules and frankly god-awful stats. They look cool, and that's about it. I mean, when you look at the Storm of Chaos roster, there are several units for the Demonic Legions that got left behind and have not appeared in Total War, and I don't think they should. Notably, these include the Chariot of Khorne, the Pleasureseekers, the Chariot of Nurgle, and the Plague Riders. This is because most of those units were replaced by new and better things. Like the Chariot of Khorne was replaced by like the Blood Throne or the Gorebeast Chariot. The Pleasureseekers were replaced with Seekers and in Total War Exalted Seekers. And the Plague Riders were replaced by Pox Riders. All that to say, I don't think the Pleasureseekers should be included as a unit because they don't fill an interesting niche in the roster, and we could have something way more interesting. Between the 3 different kinds of chariots, the 2 kinds of Seekers, and the Hellreavers, which we talked about earlier, and the Hellstriders, being the like Marauder unit, I feel like Slaanesh already has plenty of cavalry. What we need is another monster. Okay, that being said, I'm going to preface this by saying that I realize the monster I'm about to bring up is frankly not a great fit. But I just don't really see another opportunity to include it for the various Chaos factions, and it's a pretty iconic monster. The Cockatrice, in my opinion, was a bit of a weird addition to Tzeentch in many ways, and I feel like this guy is kind of a similar situation. So, arguably, the monster that best embodies everything that is Chaos is, of course, the iconic Chimera. These 3-headed brutes are fearsome predators that haunt the Chaos Wastes and only the most corrupted locales, well known for their ability to unleash devastation on battlefields. Possessing an impressive assortment of potential abilities due to their 3 unique heads and other bizarre mutations like another snapping maw on their tails, chimeras have been known to do everything from breathe fire to regenerating their wounds. The standard chimera, however, isn't quite so fierce, being far more of a glass cannon than one might initially expect. They're notably squishier than other monsters, not being nearly as tough and having far less tolerance for damage. They do hit quite hard, however, and provide a solid flying beast to terrify enemy regiments. So, what would the Chimera bring to Total War? Well, it's actually a more complex question than it may initially appear. The basic regular Chimera is not very impressive. It's a mid-tier monster at best, like the Manticore, with absolutely garbage leadership, and has a surprisingly low health pool. Like, they don't have nearly as many wounds as you would think. The standard monsters in like the Warhammer verse that are by themselves have 5 wounds. The Chimera only has 4 wounds. So it has the same amount of health as like a Manticore, which, when you have a standalone monster, 4 wounds is very low. They do have slightly more armor and would benefit from missile resistance thanks to their scaly skin. And to be fair, they hit so much harder. They hit way harder than their price point and relatively shit defense would suggest. So the way I kind of think of them is, imagine a Manticore that has better melee attack, better weapon strength, but has the pretty much the exact same melee defense. It doesn't have frenzy, so it doesn't get any of the frenzy buffs, but it also does not have feral rage. So you don't have to worry about it rampaging. It has a little bit more armor than the Manticore. Like, it has some armor, mid-tier armor. But its leadership is just as bad, if not slightly worse. And it has very little health for what you would expect. Like, you might see anything like, oh, this should have like a dragon's level of health. No. No. This is a feral Manticore level of health. The big thing they have going for them, though, the generic Chimera, is that they have an ability called Fiend Tail, which in Total War, I think the fair way to represent this would be to give them the Serpentine Tail passive, which is an ability that deals damage over time to enemies in close combat. So if you're in close combat, all enemies within 10 meters of the monster take damage. Scylla Infragram has it. Several of the Demon Princes have it. I think that would be a perfectly reasonable way to represent the Fiend Tail for the Chimera, as it basically did the same thing. It just added more attacks and gave you a bonus to hitting people behind you. So just making it where it's like, okay, it deals damage over time while it's in combat. Whoop-de-doo. Cool. So I would say that safely scoots them, the Fiend Tail, so they're dealing damage to nearby enemies. I would say that at least kind of boots them up from being a low tier monster to a mid tier monster. So, our Basilisk is our terrifying tier 4, tier 5, really scary monster, whereas our Chimera is it's a pretty okay, tier 3 looking monster. That's all it really brings to the table. It flies, causes terror. It's kind of it. The Chimera would have to be used with notable caution to get the full mileage out of these guys, and other powerful monsters like dragons or characters with monster mounts that fly would just beat the absolute snot out of them unless they got support. Though, once again, they are glass cannons, which, in defense of me putting them here, I do think is a very Slaanesh-y trait. Like, they are all about just flying in there, chewing people up, and being just devastating on the charge. Really, really powerful attackers, but you can't just leave them in combat or they're gonna have a really bad time. However, there are some really powerful optional upgrades for Chimeras. Chimeras, personally, terrorized a number of my tabletop games because every goddamn person that took them gave them their regeneration upgrade, which suddenly made them a far nastier problem to put down. In Total War, regen isn't as powerful as it was in tabletop, but it would combo well with the Chimera's function as that kind of cycle charging low leadership monsters. You know, it get in there, deal some damage, kind of like trolls, and then it breaks and runs away, heals a good bit, and then comes back. So Creative Assembly could give them that. The other upgrades that were very common on Chimeras and they had access to basically were poisoned attacks and the ability to breathe fire. So think like of the Sun Dragon's fire breath attack. So the question is, would Creative Assembly just do the basic bitch version for Total War and hide the upgrades maybe in like the tech trees for the various races? Or would they grant them some of their optional buffs to make them more like how people actually ran them back in tabletop and stuff? If the goal, I think, the best way I can explain it is if the goal was to have them be a lower to mid-tier monster as the DLC. So like your Basilisk is your big, heavy-hitting big boy monster, and the Chimera is kind of more of a really solid mid-tier monster, then I would say no upgrades. Just make it just what it the base version you got in the army book, which was Fiend Tail, so it does damage over time to very nearby enemies. It's, you know, a big flying terror causer, but crap leadership, crap defenses, hits hard, but you know, you gotta use it very carefully. If the goal was to make it more of a very firm mid-tier monster, I think granting them any of their abilities, just one of them, would immediately solve that. So give it regen, boom, very solid mid-tier. Give it the fire breath attack so it can like hit groups of enemies and deal some good damage, decent mid-tier unit. Give it poison attacks so it, you know, does debuffs when it's attacking people, decent mid-tier unit. If you were going to make it a mid to high tier monster, then give it everything. You know, give it regen, poison attacks, and a breath attack. So then it's got some really nasty options. It's got an active ability. The regen makes up for its not great health pool, and the poison attacks make up for its not very stellar like melee defense and stuff. That being said, you could just do the best of both worlds and have them be very mean-ass glass cannons capable of causing lots of damage for multiplayer that don't have any of the fancy abilities, but just make it where if you're playing campaign on your tech tree, there's an upgrade for, you know, there's like a couple of different techs that grant the Chimera access to regen, access to the fire breath ability, and access to poison attacks. And that could be very easily added. So for the Chimera, as far as what factions it would be available to, I would, of course, have it available to the Slaanesh factions. And then I would also add it to the Warriors of Chaos. There's a part of me that's like, I feel like I should put it in Beastmen, but the Chimera has not been part of the Beastmen roster for a very, very long time. It was pretty much exclusively for the Warriors of Chaos during its tenure, because it was always very heavily pitched as like, no, this is a creature that is like in the very tippy tops of the mountains where like there's lots of corruption from the winds of magic scraping across the mountaintops, and it's in the like super duper far north chaos waste near the realm of chaos, and the super duper southern chaos waste near the realm of chaos, and it's very rarely seen elsewhere. You know, it only comes out with a storm of magic, even though there's like a silly amount of stories that have chimeras running around. So thematically and like lore wise, it's just not a Beastman monster. It just isn't. It does not make sense in their roster, even though like from a very certain point of view, I feel like it kind of fits, but I would say no, it should be Slaanesh and then just all Warriors of Chaos. Anyway, that brings us to the end of our SLAANESHMAS prediction video. Please do take the time to leave a comment down below for me, if you'd be so kind, about your thoughts on my wish list here. Do you think this is the perfect DLC for Slaanesh, or have I lost my mind to excess and made some terrible errors? Is there a unit that you felt that should be included that I left out? Or are you looking at that Chimera pick and go, I understand what you're saying, Sotek, but you're a dumbass. Be sure to tell me. In any event, I am all done with the Prince of Pleasure and shall now be turning my attention to other realms. Please do stay tuned for more predictions and, of course, lots of patch ideas once CA is a bit closer to being back in the office. I have a whole bunch of things I want to talk about as far as reworking like character mechanics, adding some stuff. The Kislev rework is a big one I want to talk about. I also want to do a video talking about Ikram von Horseman and the possibility of that. And, lots of stuff. So thank you all very much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you later. Bye.